Awesome. Meredith, thanks so much for joining the Gray Zone. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, no, it's an honor. It's a pleasure. Um, I know we took the coaching course together, and we've gotten to know each other over that time. And what really inspired me was your willingness to amidst of the life of being a full time, like working full time, being a mother, living a full life, then also deciding to write a book on Stoicism. And I kind of wanted to start us off there today because that doesn't sound like an easy task. I don't know a lot of people who are writing books on top of their entire life. So I guess what inspired you to take that on?
Thanks for asking that. So I think, so kind of goes back to maybe my own history a little bit of my interest in Stoicism and in practical life philosophy, because I often felt that, we have a lot of like conventional wisdom and kind of what most people sort of think and share. And in a lot of ways, Stoicism is kind of an antidote to that. Like it's this very different way of thinking that allows us to free ourselves from some of the like normal kind of conventions of what we do every day, because it lets us ask these deeper questions and strive for a better way to live. So I think that it's been something I've been, studying since 2015 or so.
Mm-hmm.
And along the way, I started a blog, and I've been writing the Stoic Mom blog since 2016. Now it's on
Nice.
Substack. And, I also got to know members of the modern practical philosophy community. There are people out there interested in this, practicing this, writing about this, going and sharing at conferences about this. So the more I kind of got into it, the more I realized this is powerful stuff. And it was powerful for me. And as a result, as a writer and as a communicator by trade, I just really wanted to share it. So, I had a great opportunity to kind of collaborate with a couple of amazing writers who have written about Stoicism before. And when that opportunity came my way, and I can share more about like how that happened,
Sure.
I was like, I got to do this. Even though I knew I already had a lot of other commitments, it was just something that was so inspiring and motivating to me. And if you want to know more about like the whole history, I'd be glad to share if you'd like.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'd love to hear the story. There was something you said at the start of that I found kind of curious and would love a little bit more clarity on. You mentioned that there's conventional wisdom that a lot of people use, go through, embrace, and then there's Stoicism, which sits kind of in contrast to that. What what do you mean by conventional wisdom? What's an example of that, and how does Stoicism contrast?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think first, for example, like when we're growing up, a lot of times we're kind of taught or come to believe like, oh, the most important things are to like get a high paid job and buy a nice car and get a big home and, take a fancy vacation to a resort and
Mm-hmm.
maybe like, get famous on social media for like the younger generations, like
Yeah,
where
for
many
sure.
people want to be an influencer or something, and get people to like really give you a great reputation. Oh, I'm famous now. So,
Mm-hmm.
but these kinds of categories of things, such as like fame, and also be super beautiful,
Okay.
always look amazing. So all of these things are what the Stoics viewed as like preferred indifference, which means, sure, it'd be nice. It'd be nice to have some money. It'd be nice to be nice looking. It'd be nice if people respect you, but they're not what's needed to live a good life. What's
Mm-hmm.
needed to live a good life is being able to pursue kind of the virtues. And I can share more about that too, but there's these Stoic virtues,
Yeah.
and to make decisions that make you a good person and a person who kind of values the things that really matter to human flourishing, which is not being rich and famous, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So, that goes against a lot. And also like the achievement culture, like we, growing
Yeah.
up, we go into like competitive schools and stuff. You get taught that, oh, well, if I get like straight A's and I get this, like, I got an award. Okay, that's what matters. That shows my worth as a human being.
Mm.
In Stoicism, that is not the case. It is about, can you make good judgments? Can you develop your character? Can you work towards the Stoic goals of being more of a thinking person, like a rational person, as well as a community-oriented person who helps other people? The two sides, like using your brain and being part of your community, like working together. Those are very important to like that they thought human nature was.
Yeah.
And I think it's really valuable for us to go back to those kinds of basics as opposed to
Mhm.
get caught up in essentially the rat race.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a shift from external validation in all of these different ways that you mentioned to internal validation, but also like building a solid internal foundation where you know that you can rely on yourself, your judgments, your ability to make decisions, which I can understand how that can be scary, perhaps, because I don't know, like, how do you know for yourself if you are able to make good decisions, if you can make good judgments?
Exactly. I mean, one thing that I started talking about way back in high school was the burden of freedom. It's kind of an existentialist idea, and it was also it arose also in the Brothers Karamazov. I don't know if you've ever read that book, but
I've
like,
heard about it. I've gotten some bits and pieces of it. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, there's even just one part of the book about like the Grand Inquisitor that it's almost like a book within a book, a story within a story
Mhm.
about this, that's one of the kind of the touch points for this burden of freedom idea. Is like humans have this freedom. And I also read a lot of like Albert Camus and other people, back in the day. And I
Yeah.
do find a lot of like synergy between that and Stoicism, although it's certainly not the same at all. It's not. I mean, you could
Mhm.
not say like, you'd be an existentialist and then therefore you're a Stoic or something like that. But there's an interesting like crossover there, which is that we do have, I mean, Stoics and existentialists believe like humans have free will, right? So we can make decisions. And even though in Stoicism, like, of course, your nature and your human nature and the nature of like the cosmos and stuff is affecting what you do, there's this notion that you can develop your sense of judgment so that you can make better decisions. And one of those
Mhm.
things, the ways to do it is what I tell my kids, and I have blogged about this: stop, drop, and question your impressions. So we all remember like stop, drop, and roll for when you like smell
Yeah.
fire or smoke or something. It's like that because like your immediate reaction is like a knee-jerk thing, or like, oh, someone cut me off in traffic. I hate that person. I'm so angry, right?
Mhm.
But my daughter, who's now like she's my younger daughter, became sort of more infused with this. When we were riding in the car, she said to me, "Mom, maybe they're trying to get their sick mother to the hospital. You should be forgiving of them. Like you shouldn't like just." But so that's one thing, forgiving of them. But another thing would be like, why do I need to get angry about this? This is just like this thing. It's not really that important. It's not going to make me a good person, better person to get there 5 minutes earlier. It's in fact
Mhm.
going to be bad for my character if I like start getting really angry. So there are 4 primary virtues in Stoicism. Those
Yeah.
are wisdom, justice, moderation, and courage.
Mm.
And I think if you kind of believe that those things are really good character traits and good ways to be in the world, then you can kind of use those as goalposts for your judgments and for your decisions. Like I'll ask myself, is this being brave if I do this? Or is it the opposite? Is this being fair? How
Yeah.
is it going to be fair? And when in terms of the wisdom piece, a lot of that's about finding what are the actual facts, what is really happening to the best of our knowledge, as opposed to just accepting that people say this thing or that
Yeah.
someone I've heard, told me this or whatever, or like I saw it online. It's like, can you do the research to get to the facts, at least, to your extent, and then
Mhm.
make a decision based on reality? And then with moderation, or sometimes it's called temperance or self-control, it's like, how am I not letting my bad emotions get the better of me and control me in this situation? How am I not letting my anger or like road rage dictate what I do? And instead take that pause, question the impressions. The impressions are like either our sense data or our thoughts. You've probably heard the phrase, don't believe everything you think. It's
Mhm.
like that. It's you kind of take that little pause and you sort of say, wait, what's really going on here? And what do I
Yeah.
really want to do in this situation? And how will I act in a situation will make me more virtuous? In other words, build my character with those 4 parameters. And I find it to be really helpful.
Yeah, that pause I find is one of the most important parts. Like in meditation, when you recognize that you've gotten distracted, that's that key moment where you can then either allow the habit to continue of just distraction, or you can kind of like take back just a little bit of control by when you realize that you've been distracted, by then relaxing that thing and letting it go, right? Because it's not about pushing it away, because if you're pushing something away, you're actually thinking about it more, right?
That's
You're
right.
engaging
That's
with
right.
it more.
Yeah.
It's about relaxing it, and it dissipates on its own. And I find that super fascinating. And I think it's really interesting because you've obviously been engaging in this for like the last 10 years. So clearly something about Stoicism really lit a bit of a fire in you.
Yeah.
I'd be really curious just to understand what that relationship has been like with Stoicism, and what those first sparks might have felt like.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to go back to my own ancient history before I talk. So it's like many years ago, I was a student of history and literature and political philosophy. And I ended up getting a master's in history. I was going towards a PhD, and I was really interested in learning about what motivated people in the past and why they made the choices they made and what kinds of new ideas they developed. And I was interested in kind of the history of ideas, and also bringing to life people who'd lived a long time ago and what their world was like. But instead of going towards academia, I decided to become a journalist, and I wanted to kind of write history as it was happening, like,
That's cool.
modern history today, like, and real people's stories too.
Yeah.
So I worked on a newspaper, I worked on a magazine as a staff writer for both, and those were really great experiences. And as when I was a grad student at Stanford, I also was starting to explore more areas around like mindfulness and just trying to understand how to cope with some of my own anxieties and worries and sort of my own thoughts.
Yeah.
And I would say that even at that time, I remember I ran into a grad school friend of mine the other day, and she said, I remember you were talking about Stoicism back then. I'm like, yeah, I remember going to the Stanford library, and deep in the stacks, there was this little book about Epictetus and his handbook, which is a very fundamental Stoic text from the Roman period. And I was like, it had like these beautiful sort of calligraphies on it. And I was like, this is really cool. So that was one of my first encounters. But it wasn't until I actually had kids that it really dawned on me is I needed a new mindset. And I had two daughters 2 years apart. And I was raising my kids here in Silicon Valley, where it's a very kind of competitive and stressful environment in a lot of ways with my husband, and he was working in tech, and I was kind of trying to figure out what I was doing. And I just realized that I was, it was hard for me. I was becoming anxious and irritable about all the things I felt like I was responsible for with my kids that I wanted to bring to them and give them a good life and be a good parent for them, and also be someone who could cope with my own like worries and concerns and my own like questions about how to make choices, just like we talked about.
Yeah.
So I found out in around 2015 that there were other people out there questioning these things who had started to bring back modern Stoicism, bring back Stoicism from the old days, from Greek and Roman times when it started. And it was actually, it had been popular through, like it was known in the Renaissance and over time. But they were bringing it back for today. And I read an opinion piece in the New York Times about Stoicism by Massimo Pigliucci about how to be a Stoic. And I was like, this is so fascinating. Little did I know that later, here, fast forward 10 years, he's one of my co-authors on this new book.
No way. That's
yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of shows you like however, and then I noticed that as more people were getting into it, I was like, what people are into it, there aren't that many people writing about how it applies to being a parent. And that was the use case I wanted to bring my Stoic mind to. Like, could I develop a Stoic mind, and could I bring it to being a parent? And I sort of figured out ways that helped me do that. And a lot of it was letting go of like the random types of guilt and sort of fears that parents feel, because like they're always worried if they're making the right choice for their kid and for themselves. So I would say that like that really did help me relieve some of my stresses. And then in the pandemic, I started to collaborate more online with people because everything went online. Like we had some Stoic conferences online. We had panels. I was invited to speak about like parenting and what I applied my Stoicism for. And then I ended up meeting one of my co-authors that way. And then we decided to collaborate together. And I'm just going to show the book now. Here's
Yeah.
our book. So the one I met on a panel was
Cover.
Greg Lopez, and then
Yeah.
Massimo was the one who wrote the opinion piece I mentioned, and a book called How to Be a Stoic that was quite popular. And then we end up writing this book, Beyond Stoicism. There's a little more to say there. It's actually
Please.
only got Stoicism in one chapter, and in the intro, we have 13 total schools of Greek and Roman philosophy in this book, because what we decided to do was cover some stuff that hadn't been as much explored by modern practical philosophy approaches for how do you apply ideas to your everyday life from these other thinkers such as Aristotle and Socrates and Hipparchia and Hypatia. And like some people are really famous and some people are not, but it was just a really interesting exploration.
Any personal favorites that you feel worth sharing?
Sure. I mean, I actually really love Hipparchia because we have two women who are featured philosophers in here, and she's one of them. And she was a cynic. Now, when you hear the word cynic today, you think of, someone who's cynical and who's like, oh, well, kind of, I don't really think anything is really good. And I don't really believe it. Right. It was so different back then because this is the origin of the term cynic. Cynic actually meant dog-like. And they would kind of live on the street, and but there was a reason for it, which is that they really rejected all conventionality. Like they were just like, we are going to be true to nature, how we interpret it, and we're just going to be very we're going to talk back to powerful people. There's a famous story of one of these cynics talking back to Alexander the Great, who came to see him while he was lying in his bathtub on the street. That's how he lived. And Alexander's standing there and saying, what wisdom do you have for me? And he says to him, oh, just get out of my sun. Just move that way. So those were their principles, being super bold and we're all just humans. Why should I care that you're like this king? So I find it really kind of empowering. And I think there's the story of her kind of talking back to this male philosopher at a symposium. That's what we started the chapter with. And when I was writing that, I just thought, wow, I'm inspired.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing to have that feeling while you're writing it too. I'm sure it lights you up afterwards.
Totally. I was like, wow, I really feel like I'm communing with this person. And then also I also found that the skeptics were really interesting. Again, another word we use today, like skeptics. But in those days, it was about how do you determine what's really true? Kind of, which is something Stoics were also interested in, but the skeptics took it kind of a step farther. And there's a famous historical incident where a guy called Carneades in the Roman period, he went to Rome and he delivered two speeches at the Roman Forum, in Greek. He was Greek, but it was a time when Greek philosophy was the latest fad for these Romans. And they're like, ooh, what's this? And one day he spoke about justice and how it was really natural. It was what the gods wanted. It was a good thing. We should be just, we should be fair. Then the next day he came back and he said, justice is not natural. And it's if it were natural, it would be the same everywhere. We wouldn't have, Egyptians worshiping a bull and Greeks and Romans worshiping a human form god. And then the Persians saying, if you put a god in a human form, that's blasphemy and sacrilege. And things like that, all these things about principles that people believe in different places. And I was like, this can't possibly have been what really happened. But I did the research, and there's documents from Roman times that we think this did actually happen.
It's crazy.
And so it's an example of how you've got to hold your ideas lightly and actually examine what are the arguments and are the arguments persuasive.
Okay, so that I find what you just said there, you need to hold your ideas lightly. I find it super interesting to what you'd mentioned earlier around, especially as a parent, and I could see this being a leader in a business as well, you will happen to experience and carry these more negative, heavy emotions that, this is not the same at all, but I've had a dog recently. I got a dog and he was injured for a while and really limping. And I really had that experience of I want him to play. I want him to have fun and be free, but I'm causing damage long-term if I let him. And so just feeling that conflict, and again, minor scale, but holding these ideas lightly. You mentioned how learning about Stoicism allowed and made it easier for you to let go of some of these emotions that you were experiencing as a parent that you were trying to work through. that are often heavy. So it can be hard to hold those lightly. And I'm just curious to understand. I feel like that letting go piece is the most challenging. And what I love about these ideas is like, yeah, you can resonate and understand them, but how do you, everyone's so busy. We're all so busy in our lives and also feel like we're constantly behind. And so that makes it hard to slow down and properly digest these things and sit with them. But like, how do you, what do you think about from your experience around the idea of letting go and holding things lightly?
I think there are some practices we can try to do that can help us with this. And some of them are from Stoicism and some of them are from other kinds of philosophies. But for example, there's something called the view from above. And this is something Stoics practice, but there were also other antecedents in Greek philosophy where you kind of picture yourself like zooming way, way up and like, okay, I'm floating like, a mile above this situation that I'm in. How important is this? Like,
Yeah.
what is really going on here? And what's the bigger picture, the broader perspective? And so you if you are able to do that, which admittedly is really hard, but if you're able to do that, you start to think in terms of, wow, this like minor setback isn't really that big a deal. Or this argument I'm having with a coworker, let's not really like gets too involved. Like what's really at stake here? Because and I think it goes back to that idea, like I mentioned about anger, the Stoics felt, and some of these other philosophers also felt that there were something called bad passions, which is like sort of negative emotions that we can get sucked into. Anger is one of them. Seneca called anger a temporary madness because it like makes us just go crazy. And so he thought it was always bad. Anger is always bad, for example, like it's just bad for us. It makes us make bad decisions. Fear, like how much of what we do is based on fear.
Yeah.
If I'm
That's
worried
a great
about,
question.
right? If I'm worried about like my kid getting, a bad grade in this class, is that really like, what am I really worried about? Am I worried about my kid not being able to succeed at life? What does it matter, right? If she had one not perfect grade, for example. So, I mean, it's kind of about like, can you zoom out and get that bigger picture is one thing. And then I do think this idea of like pausing before you react and somehow trying to like take a breath and sort of analyze what's going on instead of like how, taking things personally is something that I think philosophers would tell you not to do because like you can easily get caught up in defensiveness, territoriality, as I
ego.
said, anger, fear, frustration, all the things, right? Yeah. And somehow trying to like balance out, well, wait, where can I find kind of like the brave part of me, or even the joyous part of me, or like the compassionate part of me, or the part of me that understands, has empathy for that other person who's asking me to do this thing that I don't want to do or whatever.
It sounds like there's a skill that can be practiced, which relates to bringing out the part of you that's best for the situation versus allowing the situation to determine through reactivity and habits which part of you comes forward.
That's really well said, Christian. I think that's very, very, very accurate to, especially the Stoic viewpoint, is we have agency. We should try to maximize that agency. And now there's an important thing in Stoicism of we can't control everything, right? That whole thing about like what's in your control, what's not, what's up to me, what's not up to me. Once you figure out that difference, you get a lot less frustrated because you realize, oh, that thing happening way over there, that's really not up to me. But here's what I can do about the things that are affecting me, or here's what I can do about what I want to, provide to the world. And so that's that agency piece of like, here's what I'm bringing in terms of my emotions, in terms of my thoughts, and in terms of my actions. Like there was this whole thing about Epictetus, who's, as I mentioned before, a famous Stoic, wrote that, it's not the things that the events that bother us, the things that bother us, it's our reaction to them, it's our response to them. And it's also like this idea that they're the things that really upset us are all these things outside our control. Like one guy came to Epictetus, he's like, I'm really angry that, my brother's so mean to me. My brother's like a mean person. He's so mean to me. What should I do? He's like, you can't, there are people out there that will behave badly. You can't control your brother. It's up to him how to behave. All you can do is try to be a good brother to him.
Yeah.
and try to not take it personally when he's not, because that's kind of his problem. So, I mean, it's difficult in practice in real life because we're constantly
Definitely.
confronted, right, with all this stuff, and
Yeah.
it feels personal. Like even at
Oh
work
yeah.
today, there was a decision made that I was like, wow, that really is going to affect me, that decision. And it's not a decision I agree with. So, what do I do? You have to look for the places where you can have an impact. And I think to me, that's why it's very empowering and sort of liberating, because it's not like controlling all of that. All of
Hmm.
that is like, I no longer live in this fantasy world that I can control all of that. I'm more trying to be like, okay, here's the pieces I can work on. Here's what I can bring. Here's what I can do.
Yeah. It's interesting too, because that initial reaction, I think in some ways isn't a choice either. That also, and so I feel like there's almost even giving ourselves some grace around when something happens, like my dog's being a nuisance and I get really mad. Okay, that's fine, but now it's more like the reaction versus the response, I think is super interesting. And I heard someone else say this, that the word responsibility, right? I think it was a meditation teacher. He was talking about how like responsibility is the ability to choose a response to our reactions. And I think it's interesting because when we feel that even the reactions are super personal, then we get sucked into them even more. It's like, God damn it, I'm angry. I'm not supposed to be angry. I shouldn't be angry. And then it's the same thing that I mentioned earlier. Like you're trying to push that emotion away,
Yeah,
which again, you're just focusing on the fact that you're angry and how that's a problem versus,
that's right. You have like
okay,
second
anger's there.
level guilt or something about the fact that,
Totally.
why am I, the type of person who gets angry, that I'm so terrible. Oh, how
Yeah.
could I do that? And you're right. You're
And
so
now
right.
you're telling yourself the story of you're as an angry person.
You're right. And then you kind of get obsessed with that piece of it, and that's no good either. I just want to share one story from
Please.
Stoicism again. It's about a philosopher who went on a boat, and they were doing this all the time in ancient Greece and Rome. They were constantly traveling by ship, right? And quite frankly, a lot of these ships had shipwrecks. In fact, that's the story of the beginning of Stoicism, because there was a guy called Zeno of Citium. He was from Phoenicia, and he was a merchant traveling with all kinds of the Phoenicians would specialize in making this purple dye that was really expensive because they had to crush these mollusks and stuff to get the dye. And it was like really hard to make, but they were the specialists. And so they would bring this dye to places. So I think he had like a dye shipment he was bringing to Athens. But he had a shipwreck and everything was lost. And he's like, oh no. So he goes to Athens, like, what do I do? And he goes to like a sort of, they had a bookstore with the scrolls and stuff. He's like looking at the books and he sees one, and the book is about Socrates. And he's like, oh, who is this guy? That's kind of interesting. Because that was like recent history at that time. Like it was in the past 100 years. And he's like, Socrates, wow, okay, that's cool. And he says to the bookseller, how can I find a guy like Socrates around here? I'd love to learn from someone like that. And then he points to a guy who's walking by, who's a Cynic philosopher, Crates, who was married to Hipparchia. And so he became a student of him. And then he became the first Stoic. He developed Stoicism. So that's one story I want to share with you. And because I love stories, I just love like thinking about how that could have happened.
And that actually then spinballing into our conversation today, like very linearly and non-linearly.
Yeah, and it's just so fascinating. And the other story I was actually thinking of before I mentioned Zeno was something about this shipwreck. Okay, so there was a guy who was a philosopher, and he was on a ship. And the ship started to enter into a storm, and there were waves, and it was like crazy weather. And the storm built up to such a point where the ship is like rocking back and forth. And this philosopher starts to turn green and look like terribly afraid. And he's like, oh, he's got that look like the Scream, maybe. I could imagine. And then this other guy comes up and I'm like, wait, you're a philosopher. You're not supposed to be afraid. And he's like, wait, actually, this fear is a natural impulse. It's what you do next that matters. It's how do you cope with that emotion? And it's just what you said. Like you could just like get angry at something because that's a natural feeling. But then what's the next thing you do? So the philosophers would want you to really think carefully about like, how do you kind of cope with that and channel it into something that not just suppress it, but kind of like realize, oh, why am I angry? What else could I be doing? What else could be true here? And it turned out they didn't actually die in a shipwreck. So later I guess they lived to tell the tale. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so interesting because I think like that what you just mentioned there, it's so easy for everyone day to day, you're working, you're living, to be get caught up in feeling like there are these people who can are philosophers or are super stoic, and that there's a difference between you and them. And in that initial moment, like everyone feels this the same or a similar reaction. And it is that response that's super different. Or that and we all have the same opportunity to
Yeah.
choose a response every single time.
Right.
Obviously it's harder to choose a response if we've chosen a different one for our the last, how many years.
Yes.
But that doesn't take away from the opportunity to choose a new response. um, and in some sense create a new life from that response, and every time it happens again moving forward.
Yes, I agree with that.
Hmm. It's fascinating. I think it's yeah. Like I mentioned at the start when you kind of asked, who the audience is here, and I don't know. I definitely feel that just on a day to day, we're all so caught up in the work that we're doing and the a million other things outside of work that we need to do that it's hard to take the time for ourselves, especially with phones and technology just in our face all the time. Like, when's the last time that, you or somebody listening to this literally just took 15 minutes and just sat on the front porch with nothing distracting them, no person talking to them, no phone in your face. Like, I think that I mentioned this at the start, but I think that if no one's doing that, then if you can start to spend a little bit more time slowing down, it's a competitive advantage because it's being undervalued by the market. And I think that's a helpful way to think about it, because we are all thinking about things in general from a competitive standpoint. So there's an opportunity to have an advantage by actually slowing down, which can feel counterintuitive. But I think that's, yeah, I don't know. This is something I think about, but it's hard to do because to slow down feels like you're falling behind, right?
It's true. It's really challenging because we are living in that kind of a race environment, right? Like where everything
Yeah.
is da, da, da. But I have found that since I adopted like a more stoic life philosophy and since I started thinking this way, I've gradually worked on myself and my skills and like how I react to things with my job and with my outside projects. It's like I do find that I have a little bit more of that spaciousness. It's
Mm,
it's like, and also a little bit less of that feeling of like I have to control everything, because I know
mm,
that I can't. And
yeah.
I try to remind myself because many years ago, I probably thought, oh, I should be able to do this and I should be able to fix that. I should be able to manage this, both with my work and my kids.
Yeah.
How is it that I can't manage to get my daughter to leave this play date without having a tantrum or something like that, right?
Yeah.
But you kind of when you realize that, oh, well, not everything is up to me. And so I'm going to work on the things that are, and I'm going to just, what makes me a good person is working towards these kind of virtues and developing my character. It's really liberating because you don't feel so weighted down by
Mm,
all the imperfections that you're constantly, experiencing both in yourself and others. And the Stoics thought that a Stoic sage was like the perfectly behaving person only came once every 500 years. Like they didn't think that this is very common, right? So we're all just like trying to get better and do our best. And
yeah.
we're all kind of prone to sort of human flaws, and to the people around us, also the people who surround us can make a really big
Hmm.
difference in how we behave and
Hmm.
the habits we develop. So, I mean, I've also thought about that a lot in terms of like trying to, surround myself with others who bring this a kind of a good mindset, and
Hmm.
try to also foster that in like people I work with about like encouraging that kind of a mindset instead of,
Yeah.
I'm sure we've all had colleagues that just were just really unhappy with what they were doing or whatever, or their work. And it can really bring you to a different mind place, And so something about this, it's not about suppressing all the bad stuff, but it's about like kind of being realistic and pragmatic and saying there's going to be bad stuff. Bad stuff will inevitably happen and be part of our work, part of our lives, but it's kind of how we cope with it and how we still maximize our own agency and
Yeah.
still try to be like good people in that
Yeah.
time.
I That's part of the reason that's why I love hosting this podcast and having these conversations with you right now. Like, it's so nice to set some intentional time aside to talk about something like this, because that is the reminder, and that does make it easier to bring it into my own life. And um, have you heard of Taoism before?
Yes, yes, I've read
Yeah,
about it. Yeah.
the philosophy of Wu Wei within Taoism,
Hmm.
or Taoism, or Tao, whatever, however you, I'm not exactly sure the best way to say it, but regardless, you reminded me of it when talking about like having your daughter and she's not able to leave a play date without a temper tantrum. And again, just me relating it to with my own life experiences, like being at the park and it's time to go and your dog won't come. And you're like, oh, I'm a horrible dog parent. I'm doing everything wrong. And then there's that inclination of like, and this is where I think Wu Wei is such an interesting lens to look through this, because Wu Wei says like it's in some ways it's like go with the flow, in other ways it's like don't try too hard. And
Mm.
if I feel personally attached to the dog leaving the park or to the kid leaving the play date without a temper tantrum, if I feel personally attached to that, and I get mad and then I let that frustration out, now I'm chasing the dog around. He doesn't know what's going on. He thinks he's having the best game ever, versus not
Okay.
trying too hard and just stepping back. Okay, I'm just going to sit down for a minute. I'm not even going to react at all.
Right.
Next thing I know, the dog's bored and he's coming over to me to play. Fantastic. I can throw the collar on and the leash on. And that I find so fascinating, that idea of not trying too hard when things get challenging and slowing down. There's a story of like if there's a really skilled butcher cutting up a, a cow that's obviously a dead cow. Like if you get to a really hard part, you don't just start hacking at it blindly, super tightly. You slow down, move slowly, and then get through it way faster and way better than if you try to like get tight when things got challenging. I just find that so fascinating. That's an idea
It
in a way.
is. That is. I think Taoism is super interesting. I have read about before. You're reminding me to do it again. Read some more and just kind of like dig into that. Also, I would say Stoicism has a lot of overlap with Buddhism.
Yeah.
I know several people who practice Stoicism, are interested in Stoicism, who are also very interested in or practice Buddhism. So I
Mm.
think that there's some really strong and interesting intersections there too.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I mean, yeah, 100%. So as we wind down here, I have one other question. I was reading Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus recently, and there's a line in there that I wanted to share with you. It's super short, but I'm curious. I've been asking different people this in my life recently just to see how it sits with them and what it makes them think of. So I'm curious to see how it sits with you.
Sure.
But what do you think of when you hear the sentence to live without appeal?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting essay, by the way. It's fascinating. And going back to what I mentioned earlier, I have studied existentialism before. I
Hmm.
think there's a lot to learn from it. I mean, I think that in that context, the existentialists and Camus didn't believe there was a God. So they didn't
Hmm.
think that you could sort of say, oh, well, I'm in a horrible situation right now, but I'll be rewarded in the afterlife, or maybe God will come down and punish the person who's making me push this boulder up a hill. So
Mm.
to me, that's sort of maybe the appeal that might be in the back of the minds of people who want to, bring a moral sense to a situation that seems impossible or impossibly hard, like
Mm.
pushing the boulder up every day, like
Mm.
Sisyphus did. And to live without appeal is, I think, to take it upon yourself to make the choices that make your own life,
Yeah.
and to kind of ensure that you're mindful enough and aware enough of what you're doing and why you're doing it. You're not just going with what everyone else does or going with what someone told you to do a long time ago or whatever. You are living what you chose, and
Mm.
you're living it in a way that, you're not waiting for some deus ex machina to come down and like fix things,
Yeah.
or to give you a break. You are kind of working to make your own luck, maybe in some ways. But granted, some people won't, people, bad things happen, and bad things happen to good people. So it's like you're in this situation. And someone like Epictetus, he was actually he was actually a slave. He was a slave before he was a philosopher, in the Roman Empire. And kind of like his way of thinking about it was, you could be in the most like constricted, awful situation, but somehow still have this inner freedom of knowing that your judgments and your mindset and your kind of way of thinking about things and moral sense is still intact and still strong. So I think that plays into this too.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Meredith. I appreciate that. I appreciate you sharing, and I appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Oh, it was great to talk to you. Absolutely.
Yeah. Amazing. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up?
I'll just share that the book is also we have a second edition, which is called Live Like a Philosopher, What the Ancient Greeks and Romans Can Teach Us About Living a Happy Life, because this is the UK edition. And we're also going to be coming out with a Spanish language edition and a Korean language and a simplified Chinese language edition. So
fantastic.
We hope that people will use it. And just one more comment about the book is that it's got each chapter has 3 aspects. One is the history of a person that shows you how they tried to live by their philosophy. I mentioned Hipparchia earlier. There's all kinds of other people in the book. The second part is sort of a quick take on the philosophy itself so that you can understand it in a really accessible way about kind of one aspect of it, like embrace uncertainty with Carneades. He was the one who said, let's look at both sides of this thing. And then the third part is exercises. So you can actually try it, like live like a week, like Socrates, live for a week like Epictetus or Hipparchia or something. So it kind of inspires you to bring it into your life and your work.
That's beautiful. I'm excited. I'm excited. I'm excited for your book and just for it to grow through the world and inspire people. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Christian. Appreciate that.
No, of course. Awesome. Cool. I will stop the recording, but thanks so much for coming, Meredith.